All right. Hey guys, hope everyone's doing well. So my name is Akri Vadud, and I'm a fifth year medical student. And today I'll be talking about the topic liver functions. So these are one of those questions that are not too bad if you end up getting them in the exam, but at the same time, of course, quite important. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So I've highlighted some of the core points that I feel are especially important in this overview. And firstly, I think it would be probably kind of nice if you break the ice with some anatomy of the liver. So, stuff like the structure, the blood supply, things like that. And as you all probably already know, the basic unit of the liver is essentially the lobule. And on average, there can be from anywhere between 50,000 all the way to 100,000 lobules. However, the important part is actually the surrounding structures. So these are basically stuff like the central vein, which, as you all probably know, empties into the hepatic vein, and then that eventually goes into the vena cava. And then, of course, you can't forget about the arterial supply, which of course comes from the hepatic arteries and arterioles, which eventually empty into the sinusoid. Also, there are basically of the many cells that are present, two important cells that line the venous sinusoids are basically the endothelial and the Kupffer cells. Now, these are basically phagocytes, so essentially meaning that they phagocytose bacteria and foreign material. Then you also have something known as the space of Dis. Um, what this it's also known as the perisinusoidal space, and it actually connects to the lymphatic system in order to help it remove any excessive fluid. So that was pretty much an overview about the anatomy of the livers, just a few important points here and there. Next, we get into the physiological functions of the liver. So as you can see listed here, there are many, many different functions. So the great chunk of it is actually made up of the metabolic functions of the liver. Now, this entails stuff like protein metabolism, lipid metabolism, and even carbohydrate metabolism. You also have a metabolism of certain drugs and hormones in a process that's typically known as detoxification. Of the other important functions of the liver, you also have filtration as well as storage of blood. As you know, the liver has a very, very large reserve or acts as a very large reservoir of blood. Also, it's very important in the formation and excretion of bile, also for the storage of vitamins and iron, and definitely for the formation of coagulation factors. So first up, let's talk about the metabolic functions. So as you all know, the liver is basically the largest gland in the body, approximately about 1.5 kg, from anywhere between 1.5 to 2 kgs. And it's essentially um, a very, very important gland or organ because of the fact that, as you can see, it's full of chemically reactant cells, which of course have a high rate of metabolism. And essentially, uh, in talking about the metabolic functions, as we said, you can divide it into carbohydrate, protein, and fats. So first of all, we start off with carbohydrate metabolism. So as we know, glycogen is a very, very important source of energy. And for this reason, the liver is able to, of course, store a large amount of glucose in the form of glycogen as an energy reserve. It's also very, very important in the ability to convert certain sugars, like, for example, sucrose, fructose, and certain other monosaccharides to glucose aside from glycogen. It also has a very important role in gluconeogenesis, um, and also quite important role in forming chemical compounds from intermediate products. Now, another very, very important and often not talked about function of the liver is actually its buffering ability. So it essentially acts as what's known as a glucose buffer, because as you all know, there are certain periods or certain times when, for example, the glucose levels in the blood tend to fluctuate, and of course, it's important to maintain these within physiological balance or physiological ranges. And in order to do this, the liver is actually quite well adapted, and it's able to, as I said, for example, convert glycogen back into glucose or glucose into glycogen according to the body's needs. Also very, very important is, as I mentioned, the gluconeogenesis. And of course, it does this using other molecules, like, for example, proteins and lipids. And it's usually done in, for example, periods of stress and or starvation, like, for example, prolonged fasting. Uh, Essentially, anywhere from greater than 18 hours usually have the onset of gluconeogenesis. And it typically also tends to use amino acids as well as basically glycerol from triglycerides. Next up, we have basically lipid metabolism. So, in the case of lipid metabolism, primarily this is done in the form of oxidation of fatty acids for energy. And of course, basically, you have the production also of large amounts of cholesterol, which, of course, as you know, is important for membrane stability. You also have phospholipids, which is important for the actual formation of the lipid membrane, so for the cell membrane integrity, and even lipoprotein molecules, which are very, very important for the transport of lipid molecules. Uh, so the process, which is basically not too important, but it's good to essentially have a gist of it, is basically that fat is initially first it's basically split into glycerol and fatty acids, and this is basically done through the process of beta oxidation, eventually to form an important molecule known as acetyl-CoA or acetyl coenzyme A, which can then eventually enter the citric acid cycle. So the majority of cholesterol is essentially converted usually into bile salts, which is then basically incorporated into bile, and the rest is usually transported in lipoproteins. So it's very important, for example, carrying other lipid molecules, like for example, chylomicrons or apolipoprotein A, B, etc. Also, as I mentioned about the phospholipids, they are typically synthesized in the liver as well, and they're transported again in lipoproteins. And after essentially being made or synthesized over here, the lipid within the liver, the lipids are usually basically sent typically within lipoprotein vehicles to the adipose tissue. And over here, as you guessed it, they're typically used for basically storage as a reserve source of energy. Um, yeah, and that's pretty much an overview of the lipid metabolism. Next, let's get into protein metabolism. So when it comes to proteins, the liver is nothing short of hardworking here too. One of the many functions that it performs is it's important, quite important in the deamination of amino acids. Also, a very, very important function is the production of urea as a mechanism of excretion of ammonia, which is quite an important part of something known as urea cycle. Um, Also, another very, very important and significant function of the liver is the production of plasma proteins for many, many different reasons. One good example is, for example, albumin, as it maintains the oncotic pressure and helps in fluid retention. Also, quite important is the interconversions of different amino acids and synthesis of usually other substances from the amino acids. So talking a little bit about the deamination process, it's actually necessary for deamination to take place because of the fact that this actually kind of opens up the molecule or makes it converts it into a form that's actually usable. And one very important thing to note is that a byproduct of this reaction is actually ammonia, which, as you know, is toxic. And usually, during this reaction, large amounts of ammonia are typically formed by this deamination reaction, in addition to the ammonia formed by the actual gut bacteria. And so, one of the compensatory mechanisms of how the liver deals with this is by forming urea, which, as I mentioned, is basically plays a large portion in the urea cycle, and it requires the formation of urea in order to prevent accumulation of ammonia, because if this goes unchecked and then ammonia continues to accumulate, this can eventually lead to what's known as hepatic encephalopathy, which is basically a type of coma that could actually be induced, and because since ammonia is quite toxic to the brain, it can cause from anywhere like between somnolence, stupor, and even coma, or even worse, death. Another important function is to actually produce certain amino acids and to make other important chemicals from amino acids, especially the non-essential amino acids, which can actually be produced in the liver. Next, we basically come to the plasma proteins. So basically, in the case of plasma proteins, basically, all of the plasma proteins, with the exception of the immunoglobulins, are formed by the liver. And of course, arguably, the most important of these are albumin. As I mentioned before, it basically accounts for the majority of oncotic pressure, so helps in fluid retention. And aside from these, there are also acute phase proteins, which are really, really important in the inflammatory process. And moreover, transport proteins for example, steroids, as well as other hormones in plasma. And of course, we can not forget about the clotting factors. And whenever there is basically loss of blood, for example, due to some sort of internal or external hemorrhage, there is basically a replacement of these proteins, typically in a few days to weeks. So apart from its synthetic function, the liver is also a very, very great storage site, not only for blood, because as you know, it performs actually extramedullary hematopoiesis during the fetal stages, but also as a storage site for vitamins, usually vitamin A, which is actually most abundantly stored, together with large amounts of vitamin D as well as vitamin B12. So the important thing is that since the liver is such a large organ, it can actually accommodate for quite a lot of these vitamins. So from anywhere up to 10 months worth of vitamin A can be stored to prevent deficiency. And of course, we know how important vitamin A is, for example, in the case of vision. Um, while up to 3 months, sometimes 3 to 4 months in the case of vitamin D, and up to 1 year in the case of vitamin B12. So those are really important. Aside from vitamins, it can also basically act as a important storage for iron. And the mechanism how this takes place is typically through a protein that's called apoferritin, which is capable of combining reversibly with iron. So essentially, when there is an excess of iron, it combines with apoferritin to form ferritin, which is basically the storage form of iron. And then when the levels reduce back or return to normal, there is basically the release of iron from the stores of ferritin, and so it forms, you can say, sort of a buffer, if you like, or an as well as an iron storage medium. All right, on to the next part. So coagulation. Coagulation, we've all heard that the liver is famous for producing proteins, but one of the very important ones it actually produces are the coagulation factors. So, namely that of fibrinogen or factor 1, prothrombin factor 2, accelerator globulin, as well as factor 7, among others. Vitamin K, of course, as we know, is required for a few of these to work, particularly those of 2, 7, 9, and 10. And so, in the absence of it, the concentrations of these proteins tend to decrease, and this could sometimes prevent coagulation. The liver also is very important in synthesizing a potent anticoagulant known as heparin. Uh, and among many other proteins that it produces, the coagulation function and the production of coagulation proteins supersedes quite a lot of the other functions because it is very, very important in actually preventing uh, the bleeding and clotting. So next, we basically come on to detox or detoxification. So as we know, so we all heard that the liver helps in detoxification, but what exactly does it do? It's quite well known for its ability to remove drugs, hormones, and even other substances. In very much the same way, many hormones which are secreted by endocrine glands, like including, for example, thyroxine, and virtually all steroid hormones like estrogen, cortisol, and aldosterone. The liver is also a major pathway for getting rid of calcium secretion into the bile, which can then essentially be excreted in the feces. Uh, and now coming to the last two, I promise. So I know it's been a little bit long, but bear with me. Um, so coming around to immune functions, so we've all heard of the Kupffer cells, right? But if you haven't, these are the resident macrophages of the liver, and blood flowing through the intestinal capillaries typically tends to bring with it large amounts of bacteria, most of which are then killed by these cells. Uh, the liver can also help in immunity by producing actually certain cytokines as well as basically growth factors, for example, transforming growth factor beta. And as we already mentioned, they also produce certain proteins like acute phase proteins that are part of the innate immune system, alongside complement proteins as well as basically certain bactericidal proteins and opsonins. Uh, they also have quite an important role in the hepatic and systemic defense against bacterial infections. And finally, we come to the formation and excretion of bile. So, um, bile is essentially, as you know, made up of bile acids, pigments, as well as other substances dissolved in an alkaline solution, as I mentioned over here, and then something sort of reminiscent or similar to pancreatic juice. Some components are typically reabsorbed in the intestine and then excreted again. This is the so-called enterohepatic circulation. So, of course, as you all know, bile is important for the digestion and emulsification of fats, and even proteins and carbs to a certain degree. Bile is also quite a good solvent, meaning a good medium for the interaction of fats and fat-splitting enzymes, as you have, for example, pancreatic lipase. Um, and essentially, that's pretty much it, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed, and make sure to subscribe to our channel. And thank you so much for your attention, and stay tuned for more.